Tucked away right at the end of the ancient book of 2 Samuel, you'll find two incredible poems. They're a song of victory and a final testament from one of history's most famous warrior kings, David. So, let's dive into this. Because at the heart of these poems, there's one powerful image that David comes back to again and again. And it's the key to how he saw his entire relationship with God.
It starts right here. This phrase, "the Lord is my rock," pops up at the beginning, the middle, and the end of his song. It's clearly the main idea. But what does he actually mean by that? Is this just a simple figure of speech, or is there something much, much deeper going on behind this one word? Well, first thing you have to know is that the Hebrew word here, sur, doesn't mean a little stone you can skip across a pond. Oh no. It means a massive, rocky cliff. Think of that rugged, inaccessible terrain that David himself used as a hiding place to escape his enemies like King Saul. So when David says God is his rock, he means God is his ultimate, unget-outable place of refuge and protection.
And he doesn't just stop with one metaphor. The opening of this poem is like a rapid-fire list of images, all hammering home this one central point: God his protector. He just stacks them one on top of the other: rock, fortress, shield. But then you get to this one, horn of salvation. What's that all about? Well, this is likely a reference to the powerful horn of a wild ox, its main weapon. So David isn't just saying God is some passive shield. He's saying God is an active weapon who goes on the attack for him, the one who actually secures his victories. But to really understand why David felt so strongly about God's protection, he paints this truly cinematic picture of the life or death situations he was in. And he does it with some of the most dramatic language you'll find anywhere, starting with this feeling of drowning. He kicks it off by comparing his enemies to a raging sea. And let's be clear, he's not talking about a literal swim gone wrong. The waves of death are a metaphor for these overwhelming enemy forces threatening to just pull him under. And the imagery just keeps building. You can feel him being trapped, completely swamped by these surging waters of destruction. He's making it crystal clear that he was on the brink, with absolutely no way out on his own. Then the metaphor shifts. Now death isn't a flood, it's a hunter. David pictures himself caught in ropes and snares, completely trapped, totally helpless, with death closing in fast. This is rock bottom. So what do you do when you're trapped and about to die? You cry out for help. David calls to God in his heavenly temple, and that one desperate cry triggers one of the most spectacular divine interventions in the entire Bible. What happens next is what scholars call a theophany, a visible appearance of God. And it is absolutely epic. The earth shakes, smoke and fire pour from God, who rips open the heavens, descends, riding the wind, and starts hurling lightning bolts like arrows. This is no quiet, gentle rescue. This is God as a mighty storm warrior, tearing through creation itself to save his chosen king. And here is the resolution. After all that cosmic chaos, the action becomes intensely personal. God himself reaches down, takes hold of David, and physically pulls him out of those deep waters of death, setting him in a safe, wide-open place. It's just this powerful picture of total personal salvation. So, God spectacularly rescued David. But now, David explains why God did it. And this is where the poem gets really complicated, and for a lot of people, pretty controversial. David makes this incredibly bold claim. He says, God saved me because I'm righteous and I have clean hands. He even says he's been blameless and has kept himself from sin. And right away, a big red flag should be going up. I mean, this is the same David who committed adultery with Bathsheba and then had her husband murdered just to cover it up. So how in the world can a man with that kind of history claim to be righteous with clean hands? To understand this, we have to kind of step into the worldview of the Psalms. In this kind of writing, things are often seen in very black and white terms. You've got the righteous, who are fundamentally on God's side, and then you have the wicked, who are God's enemies. Righteousness here isn't about being morally perfect every second of the day. It's about which team you're on. So here's the crucial point. When David talks about his own righteousness, he's saying that despite his massive moral failures, his fundamental loyalty was always to God. He fought the Lord's battles. He never became an idolater, which was the #1 sin for other kings. God saw him as having a heart after God, and in the end, hold him up as the standard, the paradigm, that all future kings of Israel would be measured against. And this brings us to David's final poem, what are called his last words.
Here, he takes his personal relationship with his rock, his protector God, and he establishes it as the model for what a godly king should be for all time. He uses this absolutely beautiful imagery to describe the effect an ideal king who rules in the fear of God has. That kind of king brings blessing, new life, and deliverance to his people, just like the sun coming out after a cleansing rain.
See, David understands that this ideal kingship is rooted in God's promise to him, an everlasting covenant. God made this permanent pact with David because of that fundamental loyalty, ensuring that his family line would endure and that salvation would come through his house.
But David's poems also point forward, and they leave us with a final, massive question to chew on. David described a king who was saved by the rock. So what would it look like to have a king who is the rock?